Chief Chapman is a retired British Army Major General. Welcome to our program, General Chapman.
It's always a pleasure to be here, Daniel.
Russia has attacked a NATO member country, Poland, with more than 19 long-range drones. What is your assessment of this so-called another phase of war in Europe, of war in Ukraine, and how can you assess the military performance of NATO's air force regarding interceptions of these drones from a military perspective?
Well, from a military perspective, I would say it's probably too early to tell from the perspective of both sides. So from the Russian side, they will, of course, look at the measurement of effectiveness assessment to see that if they were to take offensive operations against NATO and Poland in the future, how they might do that. From the NATO side, they would see what worked in terms of the NATO integrated air and missile defense and what didn't, and see if they can learn any lessons from that. Now, it seems to me that it cannot have been an accident. We generally say in some of the work I've done before that 2's a pattern, 3's a trend, but 19 is something way above that. So there's no doubt that they were probing and testing what NATO's reaction would be. Some of that is the reaction in the political domain to see if the unity remains of NATO and what the reaction is particularly of America for the future, I think. So it's a tester. I don't think it really means anything to do with war in the future. Neither do I think that it would lead to war. And I think it was probably quite right that we had an Article 4 missive from Poland, not an Article 5. We've had a number of Article 4s in the past, including over a number of incidents over Syria, and I didn't think it would go beyond that. So we'll see what that actually means, but it's really a conflict prevention mechanism in the NATO diplomatic sphere, and we'll see how that goes and whether that unity, which I've been talking about, holds for the future. I wouldn't get too worried about it. There are lots of malevolent voices which always go straight towards an arc which is to do with Article 5. That was never going to happen, in the same way that there were those voices again in sort of March 22 when you had the attack near the border in Yaroslavl, I think it was.
Also, according to BBC, NATO's air defense forces, air defense and air forces have intercepted at least 4 Russia's drones, and according to BBC estimates, this rate is lower than Ukrainian army has. What is your assessment of this rate of intercepted Russian drones? And also another fact, many of these drones were intercepted by costly missiles worth more than $1 or $2 million per one missile. What is also your assessment of this strategy to use fighter jets with really costly missiles against such cheap drones?
Well, again, you have to be slightly wary in the first assessment for 2 reasons. Firstly, one of the things which seemed to me to be a potential strength is that we know that the Dutch F-35s were involved, and we know that some NATO nations rotate aircraft into other NATO countries, including the Baltic. So the fact that they were integrated into the air and missile defense, as I said, is a good thing. The fact that only 4, the number they've given out of 19, were shot down shouldn't be necessarily something of worry for this reason. That firstly, rather like the integrated air defense of Israel, for example, the radar and algorithms of some of your defense assets mean that there are things that you just don't need to shoot down because they're going to land in very rural or agricultural areas or where there's no threat to life. So the fact that only 4 of 19 were shot down on the same night as a significant number were shot down in Ukraine shouldn't give you a sort of left and right of arc of NATO can't shoot anything down and Ukraine can shoot a lot of down. There's a lot of variables within that, which again will come out in the measurement of effectiveness assessment of the defense, and as I said, also for Russia on the offense. So just taking the raw number by itself at the moment doesn't necessarily mean too much.
And what is your assessment of also NATO's response to this? And I would like to ask you about the risks for a wider war in Europe. There have been some discussions that if NATO does not respond to this properly, Putin can do something like this again in the future.
Well, I don't think that Putin at the moment wants a kinetic war against Europe. It's strategic folly to have a war on two fronts and to mobilize against, or to have NATO mobilize against you when both the financial and military capability of NATO, if fully mobilized, would be of an order which would be far greater than what Russia can do at the moment, when they can't. They only sort of seek to contain Ukraine. But it's rather the sort of, where does this land in the sort of will space of NATO? Because although I mentioned the financial factors and the military factors when mobilized, what they will try and do, of course, is to break apart both NATO and the EU. They're two of the enduring strategic objectives of Russia, to try and propagate either extreme right-wing or extreme left-wing groups to say that, you know, Ukraine is not worth fighting for. And that's part of what they're seeking to do. So it's trying to undermine the will of some NATO countries. I don't think that would happen. And of course, I think the thing that this is often missed to those countries closest to Ukraine, particularly the Bucharest Nine, is that they freely joined NATO due to the fact that they didn't like being under the heel of the Soviet Union prior to the Soviet Union collapsing. And I don't think they want to go back into that sort of model. That is why they freely joined NATO. So it's that potential erosion of will which would be the real game if that were to happen. But I don't think they seek at the moment overt warfare, kinetic warfare or kinetic attacks against NATO at the moment. That is not to say that I don't think they still have a revanchist imperialist mindset, because they do. The best way to counter that and keep the sort of wider peace in NATO is to have a credible deterrent force. And that, of course, is why you had the enhanced forward presence coming really out of the 2014 invasion, initially promulgated at the 2016 Warsaw Summit, which led to the forward deployment in, for example, Poland and the Baltic countries.
And what is your assessment of the US reaction to this another hybrid warfare from Russia? I mean, US President Donald Trump's reaction, we haven't heard any kind of condemnation of this attack from US President.
Well, I think it's disappointing again, and I think really from the 15th of August onwards, with the date of the Alaska summit, we've had a series of disappointments, really, I think, from Putin, from Trump's perspective, if you're in the West. We always have this sort of 2-week or else warning from Trump, which never takes place. And so it was seen to me to be slightly odd yesterday that we had J.D. Vance saying that if we have peace, you know, we can go back to doing economic business with Russia. We don't really seek further sanctions against them. That seems to me to be the one method that you really could unhinge the Russians at the moment, not necessarily by military victory, but by helping to implode the Russian economy. That would help exacerbate the problem they have with the very effective Ukrainian long-range strikes on the oil refineries, which mainly took place in August. If you can amplify that along the extract, refine, move, consume sort of line of oil by hitting the consumers, particularly those in China and India, by either the secondary sanctions of, Trump's talked about 100%, the Senate's talked about 500%, particularly Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal. And it could come to the point where we do have this sort of real spat between the legislature and the executive in America, because Trump doesn't seem to be moving anywhere. There could be good reasons for that, and I do think he's just instinctively someone who wants to end the war, but there's a big difference between ending the war in a just way from the Ukrainian perspective and the other alternative from a surrender peace perspective from a Russian perspective.
You just mentioned about Trump's intention to end this war. There have been lots of discussions about the possibility, options for the US to provide security guarantees for Ukraine. Even the idea of deploying the neutral country, third country like China's troops to Ukraine as a part of peacekeeping mission, US providing air support for European forces. What is your view of this big debate of security guarantees for Ukraine and US commitment to help with something?
Well, I think you again have to go back to Alaska, where Witkoff, the interlocutor with Russia, sort of came out of that all starry-eyed, sort of saying that he'd got Putin to agree to Article 5 like security guarantees, and therefore you would go from a three-phase posture, as it were, where firstly you'd have the security guarantees, secondly you'd have the bilateral between President Zelensky and Putin, and thirdly you'd have this trilateral with Zelensky, Putin and Trump. The Russians have really rode back from that, sort of saying that wasn't really on the agenda, that's not their interpretation, and that they do not want to see any type of force, however you posit it, peacekeeping, reassurance, deterrence in Ukraine at all. That really, to me, is the crux of the matter, because you've got three issues which are very well articulated, I think, by the Polish president. And of course, that's relevant because Poland was invaded by the Soviet Union in 39-40. And the three issues, of course, are what you mean by independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Finland, after the Winter War, managed to preserve its independence, but it didn't preserve its sovereignty and it didn't preserve its territorial integrity. That is the same conundrum that we face in Ukraine at the moment. It doesn't seem that Putin is in the mood to give any concessions at the moment. And some of the nomenclature which has come out of Trump previously about, for example, saying that Russia's already made a concession by not taking all of Ukraine is pretty ludicrous. So Trump doesn't look at this through a prism of sort of Reagan republicanism, of stepping in early to stop things. I think he looks at it through two prisms. One is this, he would like to see the killing stop. And the second one, I do think he looks at it through a sort of mercantilist economic prism. But that sort of geoeconomic theory that you can bind countries together by doing trade is just not proven. It went out of fashion about 40 years ago, because rather like Putin has demonstrated, leaders of the world are not bookkeepers or accountants. They look at power, the accumulation of power, and the extension of power, and that's what Putin is doing at the moment.
From your perspective, what are the options for US President Trump to provide so-called security guarantees for Ukraine? Because US media outlets reported that Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Tkiie, presented Trump with four military options on security guarantees. How could they look like?
Well, the job of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and any of the combatant commands, and I worked at CENTCOM, is exactly to do that, is to provide options for the president, and it's for the president to then select which option he wants. And generally that would be in any mission that the US are doing, from a sort of humanitarian perspective on the left of arc to a full-scale invasion and knocking over a country on the right of arc. And that's the difference between plans and policy. And it's for the politicians in democracies to come up with the policy which is going to be layered on top of the plan. So what we think that the right of arc that Trump is going to allow is something like air support, with the front line being done by European countries or the countries of the willing. He's absolutely excluded at the moment any boots on the ground. But I think that's also a policy flaw, because I don't think you should ever exclude anything from the policy domain. And of course, things can change again. So, things might not be as clear-cut as we think at the moment, and we'll just have to wait and see.
Let's also cover Russia's next strategic aims in Ukraine. For how long do you see this war can last, and for how long can Russia sustain this effort?
Well, I think the last time we talked, Daniel, at the end of the program, we had an offside where we both, I think, agreed that the fighting would still probably continue for the rest of 2025. And I still think that's the case. I think we're caught, certainly from a Russian perspective, in the sunk cost fallacy, where they don't know how to get out of this, even though the losses are colossal. That is, massive losses for minimal gain, but they can't see their way out because they need to try and achieve something of their strategic objectives. We know that the minimal objectives they want to achieve are the Crimea and the four oblasts, Zaporizhia across through Kherson and in the Donbass. They will keep going, I think, until they get that or can get it by negotiation. I mean, I think it's quite right that President Zelensky has said this thing must be settled by diplomacy. But I do think there's still this view in Russia that they will outlast the West. That is not outlasting as I said, the sort of military or financial might of the West, but outlast the sort of political will. I don't think that also is on the agenda at the moment. So we're stuck in this stasis, which again, I think President Zelensky is very wisely articulated that, Ukraine is not strong enough to kick all of the Russian soldiers out of Ukraine, and Russia is not strong enough to take all or even major parts of Ukraine. That is the conundrum we face at the moment, with both sides having to keep on fighting because neither have achieved any of their strategic objectives. And of course, the strategic objective for a just peace for Ukraine is sovereignty, and territorial integrity is still a whole Ukraine from the 1991 referendum.
Let's cover also the so-called axis of evil and this summit in China and this not only summit and military parade in China. Chinese leader Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and leader of North Korea and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, they all both participated in this parade, stood publicly for the first time together, trying to present a strong alliance between all these countries. What is your take on this matters, military parade and both diplomatic also outcome of the summit?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to look at this first through a Chinese perspective, that was signaling as much for regional powers in Asia about the rising might of China and to try and accommodate with China rather than to take action against that. That's why the parade was the size it was. It was signaling from a regional perspective. I think from a Ukraine-Russia perspective, it's kind of, again, a follow-on from Putin's perspective of the Alaska meeting in terms of, hey, I've got friends. And there are the two countries, or particularly the leaders of the two countries, he sat alongside, of course, really interesting, firstly, because of the overt military support that North Korea has given, both in terms of munitions and manpower, and secondly, because China doesn't want to see Russia lose. So it will either directly or indirectly make sure that China is in a position where it doesn't achieve that sort of that strategic loss. That is why I've said a number of times that there are so many variables that doing a straight line task of how this war will go in 3 months, 6 months is always very difficult to do, because war is the most complex activity and those variables are so many and so varied.
And also, do you expect China to increase its support of Russia to Russia's war effort in Ukraine and provide not only dual-use technology but also military hardware?
No, I wouldn't. I think that would be a last straw for America. There's no doubt from an American perspective, it is the rise in China, which they see as their real strategic threat. The pivot to Asia has never really taken place in the way they wanted because of events dear boy, particularly what happened in the Middle East with the rise of ISIS, and CENTCOM has always been the predominant use of American manpower rather than US Indo-PACOM. They'd like to have that as their main effort, not the Middle East.
And also, I would like to cover with you the support for Russia by Iranian regime. What is your assessment of this ongoing effort by Iran and its also commitment to provide Russia with Iranian Shahed drones and this kind of technology? Also, Russia has intensified its drone attacks against Ukraine, and it has launched more than 800 drones per night. It's a new record by the Russian side. What is your take on that?
Well, both get benefit. I think Iran gets more benefit than Russia. The Shahed is not that successful. That's not to say I'm being complacent about it. They're being regularly knocked down now by counter-drone technology, particularly from commercial companies. That was part of the stuff which was announced in London today by the Defense Secretary. Russia won't come to Iran's aid. That was shown really in the summer. Iran will come to Russia's aid, but that's more in terms of the drones and stuff like that rather than overt manpower. So it's a marriage of convenience. It's a way for Iran to get around sanctions. It isn't helpful because, of course, it's a production line which aids Russia. But that will continue. I don't see that being broken, and that's why, again, you're right to sort of say we're now in this sort of authoritarian axis again, in the way that Bush Senior used to talk about, or Bush Junior used to talk about, the axis of evil 25 years ago.
Thank you, General Chapman, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine. Thank you, Daniel.